My guest for this podcast, Gregory Nedved, really wants us to know that you can start a language learning and use anytime at all in your life, and that language can take you anywhere. So, where will you go in your life with language and culture?
Welcome to episode 122 of It's About Language, hosted by Nora Lulich-Jones. Today, we're embarking on a linguistic journey with Greg Nedved, a visionary leader at the National Museum of Language since 2008. As an acclaimed U.S. Defense Department historian fluent in Chinese Mandarin, Greg's career spans nearly 3 decades. Join us as we explore his captivating endeavors, from crafting a history language calendar to uncovering presidential foreign language trivia.
Well, Greg Nedved, welcome to It's About Language. So glad to have you back this time for a solo recording.
Thank you for having me, Nora. I'm Greg Nedved, and again, I'm delighted to be here today to have this opportunity to, for lack of a better way of saying it, talk about myself and my language initiatives, of which I've had a few. I've now at the National Museum of Language. I'm the former president. I was president from 2018 until 2023, and now I'm helping out in a number of ways. I'm running programs. I'm finding speakers for them, but I've also got a couple of other things I've been working on down through the years. I'm trying to create a language calendar. Basically, what that is there are 365 days in the year. I'd like to have a language historic fact for every single one of those days. And I'm not there yet. I've got 18 to go. Like, for example, January 1st, 2009 is when the Chinese, the People's Republic of China decided that they would make Pinyin their official romanization system. And we have one coming up in February 21st, International Mother Language Day. That's another one that's on my list. So this is something I've been working on for some time. Another thing, too, is a few years back, I wrote a book, which I'm updating now. Soon, hopefully it'll be marketed pretty soon, on presidential foreign language trivia, where I've recorded facts about our presidents and their language backgrounds. And it's a book that I put out in 2016, and I'd like to argue it's the most comprehensive thing I've seen on it, actually, because I provide sources and I cover every president, we've had. One of the reasons I'm updating it is because it's old now, 2016. We've had a couple of presidents since. So that's basically what I've been up to lately. I still work, I'll be retiring from the federal government pretty soon. And actually at the end of March, and I am teaching a basic Chinese Mandarin course at a community college at night. In fact, it starts up again in February. So I'm trying to stay active in language.
You certainly are. And I want to touch on basically all of those things. I would like my listeners to understand that when you talk about working at the federal government with the federal government and teaching the Mandarin Chinese, that people are probably, based on the kinds of experiences they've heard when they listen to folks that are engaged in language, are thinking that you started this early. You've always taken a look at what direction languages can take you. But you did not start early, did you? I think you have a little unorthodox beginning with languages. Can you tell us about that and about how you found pathways?
Yes, that's interesting. I'm one of the few people you're going to run into anywhere. I think I've met one other person who became a professional linguist without ever taking a language in high school. Which is pretty interesting. I never had any French, Spanish, German until I went to college. And believe it or not, my first language was Chinese. And what's interesting here is I made a lot of stupid mistakes in learning the language because I'd never had any language training before. It's kind of funny because, like, for example, I literally refused to believe things because it didn't make sense to me. No one can talk like that. That's illogical. And now looking back at it, it was just all silly. But those are the kind of stupid mistakes you make when you first learn a language. And then I became good in the language, and I became an Army linguist. And then from there, I got hired by the government, and where I've worked language for many years, not so much anymore. I mostly just do history. Currently I'm a historian for the government. And again, I'll be retiring at the end of March. The Chinese, the language work that I do is just all for fun these days.
You provide such an interesting perspective. If I go back to continue to mull over this, enjoy it, frankly, is because you began your learning as a reflective adult. That response of, wait a minute, this makes no sense, this sensitizes you, I think, in a way that those that have begun their language learning early or who come from heritage language experiences, that you can articulate some of the things that are happening when people look at, listen to, and confront languages. What are some of the things that you are able to do in your work, in your life, for fun or for work, that reflect that unique experience of beginning as a rank beginner as an adult to confront language?
Basically, I have learned from this, my early mistakes in learning languages. Like, for example, 3 years ago, I started learning Czech, which is my ethnic language. Both of my parents spoke Czech. I myself never really learned it. I decided that I would learn it, excuse me, for fun. This actually happened during COVID. And I discovered that it was, in some ways, easier to learn because I now knew what I was doing as opposed to before. But what's interesting there is that Czech is a pretty difficult language. I thought Chinese made a lot more sense than Czech. See, I'm still looking at it sort of analytically. And what I used a one of these online language learning programs that you have, and it was great in a lot of ways, but it didn't provide any grammar assistance. So I had to figure the grammar out on my own. And I remember talking to my wife, who was able to explain a few things to me because she had a background in Russian. And she understood the grammar when I didn't understand it because they didn't provide any grammar explanation. But I would say that my experience is somewhat unique in the sense that other people have had languages basically from the time they were born. They were speaking more than one language, and I had to learn it, older and pretty much on my own. Well, I mean, at least I had to learn the hard way.
When you are talking about now, and congratulations, by the way, on your impending retirement after many years of working. You work for the federal government. Can you let us know what specifically you do there, or as close as you can, depending on what status of what department in the federal government?
Sure. I got hired as a Chinese Mandarin language analyst. That's a term now. I don't know if you know that. In the old, we don't have linguists anymore. We have language analysts because you do more than just translate things like that. When I was in the Army, I went to the Defense Language Institute out in Monterey. I'd actually had some Chinese before because I learned it in college, like I said. But I got more of it at the Defense Language Institute in Monterey. And the focus there, and this is what the federal government mostly wants, at least it did back then, was listening and speaking. They train you to listen and they train you to, I'm sorry, I misspoke. Listening and reading. That's very important. Listening and reading. Those are the skills that they want because you have headphones on or you're reading something. The writing and the speaking, not so much. That kind of depends on your job. You are taught that, but that's not the focus. And at least, in my experience with the federal government, is that's essentially what you do. I mean, you have the headphones on and you're reading, and the stuff you're reading can be pretty difficult. So that's a quick and dirty of what what I have done down through the years. And then after I got out of that, I went to the language school and I became an instructor, and I ran the Chinese department for a while. I ran the Korean department as well for a little bit. And then after that, I got my current job as a historian, where I don't really work with languages so much except for fun.
When you're working as a historian, how do the languages have an impact on how you look at things? You did already mention the two wonderful books that you have. I'm looking forward to the calendar to be finished. We're recording, by the way, on January 22nd of 2024. And do we have a historical item for January 22nd?
On January 22nd, 2009, voters in Nashville, Tennessee, rejected a proposal to make English the only government language. The vote was 57% to 43%.
Now, when we take a look at that little factoid, and based on your experience with languages in the world for fun and for work, that is a interesting and it's a fairly significant little vote, for example. There's a lot of unexpected things that can happen once you get engaged with language, as you and I have chatted about and actually you've written about. When you take a look at something like that, would you have expected people to have provided an option for other languages rather than to close in on, say, English only? And
Well, one of the things I've learned is you don't really have expectations, believe it or not, because they usually just disappoint you. In my research on the presidents, English as the official language has been a big issue. And for example, Theodore Roosevelt, who was one of our early presidents, he's on Mount Rushmore. He's a pretty famous president. He was one of those that was a big English only president. Now, this was 100 years ago, and things have changed, but that kind of stuff is still with us all the time. So in these calendar factoids, I'm looking for any language-related thing I can find. And some of them have to do with, for example, a certain linguist was born, some legislation was passed. This is the day that a movie, a foreign language film that did very well, premiered. So that's the kind of thing, that I'm looking for. But nothing really it surprises me too much on stuff like that. Again, I'm looking at it from a historic point of view. I'm looking at it as strictly as a historian. I'm reporting what happened.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now, when you take a look at your presidential book, which you're revising and updating based on its copyright of 2016, what are one, or if you wish, more than one stories of the contents that you're like, I think people really should read about this. This is interesting. And I'm glad as a historian that I'm able to share this.
There's a lot of fun anecdotes. The first thing that I would tell people is, and I don't know what their expectations were. Again, we're talking about expectations. Is there a correlation between knowing languages and being a good president and a bad president? Some of our presidents knew several languages and some of them didn't. And interestingly, there doesn't appear to be much of a correlation. For example, George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, who I think almost anyone would recognize as being, great American presidents, neither one of them had particularly strong language backgrounds. They had a little bit, but not much. I mean, foreign language. Then on the other hand, you had someone like John Quincy Adams, who probably was our best language president in terms of his knowledge of languages and what he did with them. He was considered, at least by most historians, to be sort of an obscure president. No, it goes both ways. Thomas Jefferson knew a lot of languages. So, there's your case as well, that here's a guy that proved that having a good language background could make you a pretty effective president. In the early days, our presidents, the languages, believe it or not, in the early days that you wanted to learn were Latin and Greek. Those are the classical languages, and also French. But in terms of our presidents, we didn't really have much Spanish until later on. Now, Spanish is a very, very common language for our presidents. But speaking of anecdotes, let me give you talk about George W. Bush. Who one of our more recent presidents. He had a reputation for being, and I think we all remember this, as sort of a bumbler with the English language. They were always making fun of things he would say. They misunderestimated me. Things like that was a famous quote of his. He actually was pretty good in Spanish, and that's missed sometimes. So there's a perception that's missed sometimes. I remember Jay Leno did the NBC comedian did a stint on Bush, where he would have Bush, just screwing up in English and then speaking Spanish like he was, giving a lecture somewhere, very, very professionally, very, very clear sounding. You have those kind of misconceptions. That's one of the classic ones. We had presidents that had a lot of effect on the English language. That's another one that I bring up in my book. Like, for example, Abraham Lincoln popularized the term Michigander, someone from the state of Michigan, a Michigander. And he used that term, and it was sort of a derogatory term, believe it or not. But eventually it became, at least when he used it, now it's referred to as someone from Michigan, a Michigander. So there's all kinds of these little things out there that you wouldn't expect.
I have a question about a piece of vocabulary then, since we're into it. Wasn't normality the word until a president got a hold of it?
Oh, you mean normalcy? Normality? There was a guy by the name, one of our presidents was Warren Harding, and he popularized the phrase return to normalcy. And this had to do with, bringing the United States back to a calm situation, because we had just been in World War I, and his campaign slogan was return to normalcy, or that was his theme. Let's go back to the good old days. That's an example there of people learning vocabulary words correctly or incorrectly. Snowmageddon from the year 2010, as I understand it, was actually, that term came from President Obama. So there's a lot of very interesting presidential factoids about languages. I mean, they're just fascinating. I could go on and on about them. For example, if people were to ask me, who is our best president with the German language, I would say Bill Clinton, which is not something you would necessarily know. But again, getting back to, as I said before, Abraham Lincoln or George Washington, the two most famous, at least considered to be the two best American presidents by many historians, neither one of them had particularly strong language backgrounds.
Fascinating. And on my website, fluency.consulting, as I'll be mentioning, there'll be links to where folks can buy your book. And tell us about your calendar, when it will be available, do you think?
I've been working on this for a little while. And one of the things that I hoped to do was to post it on the National Museum of Language website. But I've decided I needed to finish it first.
Yes, I can understand. Well, thank you. And speaking of the National Museum of Language, Greg, were indeed the president of it. You're still deeply engaged with it. There was a development of for example, the language flag that was a concept. Speak some about your relationship with the National Museum of Language and the National Museum of Language relationship with the kinds of information and experiences that people should know about.
Okay, well, you mentioned the flag. That was something that I was involved in directly when I came on board in 2008. And One of the reasons we came up with the flag idea is because there really didn't exist out there anywhere a flag representing languages across the board. Now, there are flags for languages, like Esperanto has an actual flag, but there's no language for French, or there's no flag for French, for Spanish, for German. And we just decided we would do that for the National Museum of Language. So it became our symbol. If you look at our website, it's now our logo. So our museum logo is the tree that you see on our site.
When people do go to the website of the National Museum of Language, what opportunities, what interesting things will they find? What will they learn?
Our website is as good as it's ever been. Now, that's the kind of thing you'd expect me to say. But we have a lot of things on there that could benefit people. In fact, we're trying to market or even volunteer information to teachers because we are a National Museum of Language. Excuse me, we're nationwide, but we're also worldwide. To be a little bit more specific, if you look at our site, you'll notice that we have a social justice section of poetry in all different languages from various times in history. And we've done a program on that where we have a cartoon section. Where you go on there and you look, you'll see some classic Greek cartoons, Greek humor from the days of Plato and Aristotle. What we're currently working on, we're not done with it yet, and it's really going to be fun, is a joke section where we're collecting all jokes from around the world. And that one is pretty interesting because you have to be very careful because humor is, sensitive. Like, for example, let me talk about China, for example. Humor was considered to be anti-Confucian. Now, well, you might get the impression, and Confucius, of course, Confucius had a big effect on China for many, many centuries, and to an extent, even today. You might get the impression from this that the Chinese are like dour people with no sense of humor, and because it was drilled into them to not be that way. Well, that's really not true. They have a great sense of humor, and they just have different types of things that they find funny. For example, puns, things about the language, just like we would in English. Puns are dad type of jokes they find pretty funny. But relationship jokes are not very good or can be kind of offensive. Like, for example, in the United States, and I'm not saying this is good or bad, but this is just, excuse me, the way it is. Like a husband will make fun of his wife's cooking, or the wife will make fun of her husband being a slob. That's not the kind of humor you want in China because of the relationships that have developed, sort of a familial type of relationship. It's insulting and it causes people to lose face. So this is the kind of thing that you look for in jokes. So there's a weeding out process, and what we're saying is that the joke doesn't have to be funny in English, but it should be in that language. But that's another thing that we have on our site, a trip to Puerto Rico, where you go online and you will see people getting on a cruise and traveling to Puerto Rico, and you click on a slide and it brings up all these factoids about Puerto Rico. There's some tremendous language resources on there. It really is. It's better than ever, and it's getting better all the time. So there are things that we offer students of all ages, essentially, for our site. I think that better answers the question.
It does indeed. And I noticed throughout that there is a sense of the language is embedded in culture, and that sensitivity to culture is also part of what the National Museum of Language helps to bring to people that are exploring. Okay. Now, you yourself are also engaged, well, you're engaged in many, many activities around with your historian and linguistic and just general interests. Here's one that I would like to ask you about. The preservation of Native American languages and cultures. You're also engaged with that, are you?
A few years back, I funded a recording in the I think the best way to pronounce it is the Mi'kmaq language. Now, what is that? All right, this is a language in Canada. It's a Canadian language, northeastern Canada, to be a little bit more specific. The maritime provinces, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island. And there was a cartoon, I think it was from the year 2002, that ran on the BBC, I'm sorry, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, the CBC, and it actually apparently was it was an award-winning cartoon. It was a Mi'kmaq cartoon, but it was in English. It was this, they call them First Nations. Here we say Native Americans. They're called First Nations in Canada. But this was a First Nations cartoon. And what I did was I contacted the producer of that cartoon. Her name was Catherine Martin, who was Mi'kmaq. And I told her I would be willing to put that in Mi'kmaq to pay for it if they could find someone to actually do it. And they managed to do that. We were able to find a way to put the actual cartoon, dub it in actual Mi'kmaq. And it's a Mi'kmaq creation story. It's a children's story. And so we were able to do that. And I have a copy of it, and it's available. We don't really do too much with it anymore. But, it was one of the more successful projects that I had a while back in terms of native language preservation. So I'm very proud of that. And our museum we have presentations all the time on native language preservation. So that's one of the things that we really believe in.
That's huge. Thank you so much, Greg. And therein lies another trail to go on. The preservation as a concept, preservation of languages, preservations of the way that they are written. The National Museum of Language right now is a partner with the endangered alphabets. You had a presentation over the weekend, and what are some of the things that you are engaged with then in this partnership and support?
There's a man by the name of Tim Brooks, who I know you interviewed, Mr. Brooks. He runs endangered alphabets, and he is trying to get January 23rd, which is tomorrow, by the way, to become World Endangered Writing Day. He wants this to become a factoid so that every single day on January 23rd, and he asked our help. And one of the things that we did was arrange for the speaker, Mr. Oreem Yosef, who we just had over the weekend, as I mentioned, who gave this terrific presentation on African scripts. He was recommended by Mr. Brooks. But more to the point, we are trying to get UNESCO, and this is something I'm involved in myself directly, UNESCO, the United Nations organization, to recognize January 23rd as World Endangered Writing Day. And we're having a little bit of success. We're not going to make it this year, but we are going to be sending a representative to the United Nations. It won't be me. It'll be someone else from our museum who's going to, I guess, for lack of a better way of saying it, make a pitch for this in the future. So maybe next year at this time, January 23rd, 2025, will be the first year that we actually have a UN recognized World Endangered Writing Day.
That would be phenomenal.
So that is something, that we're involved with directly.
Phenomenal. Now, why? Why is this important? Why should those that are listening to this podcast say, this is an important thing for me to pay attention to?
Well, Nora, the answer is the word endangered. I mean, when these languages go away, and the written language, when they go away, you can't, I don't know, maybe you can nowadays. I understand that there are some ways to bring back revived dead languages. There are scientific ways of doing it. I'm not an expert there, but at least it seems to me that if you're losing these, if nothing else, they're going to be very, very hard, if not impossible, to get back. So once they're gone, you've lost them. So I think we need to preserve those as best we can. And there's an understanding of this. There's a lot of efforts out there to do that, and that's a positive. So that's at least my thinking on it. And I'm not saying anything that no one else could logically figure it out. These are endangered languages. They are endangered alphabets, and they need to be preserved.
When you interact with people that are in the National Museum of Language or come to the site, what are some of the common questions, needs, hopes, expectations from reaching out and connecting about language?
Okay, one of the things I think, the misconception I think people have, first of all, when they see National Museum of Language, they think that we're an actual brick and mortar facility. We haven't been that way for a few years. We're entirely online. Most of the other questions we get are more pertinent to what we do, and we are able to help them out, give them what they want, satisfy them better.
That's great. What kind of story do you have to tell of folks that have come to you, to the National Museum, however you want to interpret it, and discovered something and gone on a journey, a direction that they wouldn't have expected because of what they have discovered?
What we do is we get people excited about languages. If you look at our site, one of the words that's listed in our as part of our basic, our theme, our mission is the wonder of language. We want to get people excited about language. And hopefully by looking at our site and looking at the things we have to offer, they will do that. I don't know of a particular case, at least it hasn't been my experience, that someone's life was changed necessarily by a program that we had or anything like that. I think it's more planting seeds.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the best way to look at it.
Plant those seeds, indeed. Let's return to you and your experience with Chinese. When you first started taking Chinese, and you would use that phrase at the beginning that was like, people don't sound like this. Well, what were some of the other, say, discoveries? What made you decide to stick with it? What role, why has it played such a role in your life?
Okay, the reason I got in Chinese in the first place, and I mentioned this earlier, I never had any language background. I went to college, and the college I went to had a language requirement. And I wasn't much interested in French, Spanish, or German. And by the way, it was hard for me to get into the college because I didn't have a language background. I had a liberal arts, it was a liberal arts college. But what they did have was an overseas Chinese program. It was affiliated, the college I went to, St. Vincent College in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, was a Benedictine college. And they had a mission in Taiwan. So I applied for the program, and this allowed me to get my college credits. I spent my junior year in Taiwan learning Chinese. And that's how I got going. That's how I got started. Once I actually got into the language and I started accepting things instead of fighting it, I realized that, hey, there's a future here. It's the kind of language, that, and even to this day, it's true. If you know Chinese, you're not going to have a problem getting a job because there's always going to be people wanting you because of your Chinese language background. And so again, I went into the Army where I really got good in the language. I got better in the language in the Army than I ever did in Taiwan. And then I kind of went from there. It was a stepping stone that allowed me to go on and work professionally in the language, both for the government and where I currently am now.
That's phenomenal. Now, when you think about your own personal, say, take on Chinese, the language, the culture, what is it that you find especially enjoyable to mull over or to share with your students, for example?
Okay, well, I like to tell people I have an interesting approach to teaching Chinese. And again, I teach a very basic course, a 5-week course in Anne Arundel Community College. And I don't start by giving them simple phrases like hello, goodbye. I focus on the numbers. The numbers is how I start, because with the numbers, you can do so many things. The numbers are great building blocks. But to get them interested in the language, I show them how the numbers are written, and I try and make it as simple as possible. For example, a cross, what we would consider a simple cross is the number 10. A straight line is 1. 2 straight lines is 2. I mean, they're different lengths, but I try and say, hey, there's a logic to this language. And I also try and tell them that Chinese is really not as hard as it might seem in terms of the understanding of it, the logic of it. It's very logical. In many ways, it's simpler than English. What's hard about it, what really throw people are the tones and also the the writing system. It's very difficult to write Chinese characters. But once you get past that, it's really a pretty straightforward language. And I try and remove the fear from the language. That's kind of my approach.
Removing fear is a really important aspect there. People are afraid of languages, especially those that are written, speaking of endangered languages and writing systems, that are written in ways that we don't recognize right away. Thank you very much, Greg.
You're welcome.
Now, we've talked about a variety of items about your life, your work, what you've published. What is it that you want to make sure that the listeners have heard from you, from your perspective, your experience? What listeners to a podcast about language and culture together, would you like to repeat or re-emphasize or bring anew that I did not yet ask about that you would have liked to have talked about to the listeners?
Well, I would say from my experiences, and this is actually reflected somewhat in our National Museum language, you can do a lot with languages. If just because you're having a problem learning, Arabic or Bulgarian or Swahili, and you think language is not for me, something like that, there's a lot you can still do with it. Like, for example, I've come up with the language calendar. I researched our presidents. There's just a lot you can do with languages. It's not simply reading, writing, speaking, and listening. I think that's the message that I would pass on to people. I understand that my own situation is somewhat unique. Not everyone is like me. No one's like me. That's why I'm unique. But that's at least the message that I'd like to convey. That it's kind of like if you have a bad job, it doesn't mean work is bad. You need to go somewhere else and try something else. You have to find a niche that works for you. You have to find a place and go from there. Some people will search for that niche, forever, and they may never find it, unfortunately. But others, I think it's important to get a niche. I think a niche is what makes people successful. Ultimately, you find the thing you like, where you think you have a future, and you pursue it, and you're comfortable doing that.
And there's all sorts of opportunities, depending on how you just go to take a look around, that language can take you in unexpected ways, like we've discovered in experiencing what you have done through the years. Greg, this has been so much fun. Thank you so much for bringing about the information about yourself and your unique experience, the National Museum of Language, and all the other things that you've shared with the audience today.
Well, thank you, Nora, and thank you for what you do. These podcasts are wonderful. And I hope others will go back and, that they haven't been listening to them, to go and listen to them, because you interview so many different types of people. And you're actually showing that yourself that you can do a lot of different things with languages. Your niche is a podcast. How's that?
How's that? That's a good find there. I'll thank you very much for that, Greg. And I certainly have indeed enjoyed, and I think our listeners can tell, using the language and being able to talk to wonderful people such as yourself. Thank you, Greg. Take care.
Okay. Thank you, Nora. Yeah. Happy New Year.
Thanks so much for listening to this podcast with my guest, Gregory Nedved. Please do check out his biography and resources and pathways at my website, fluency.consulting. Where will language and culture take you? Be sure to share your adventures with those around you and with me. Until next time.